July 7, 1943. 09 to 15 hours, the southern face of the Kursk salient. The heat is more than atmospheric. It is a physical weight, thick with the smell of scorched rye and diesel exhaust. Inside a shallow, crumbling trench near the village of Sirtsevo, Sergeant Mikhail Petrov presses his back against the dry earth. Above the lip of the trench, the horizon is no longer sky, it is steel. A Tiger I, its gray hull caked in Russian dust, lurches forward. Every time its 80-mm gun fires, the pressure wave hits Petrov's lungs like a hammer. Beside him lies a strange hollow metal tube, barely 5 feet long. To his veteran unit, accustomed to the heavy, reliable crack of the PTRD anti-tank rifle, this American Lend-Lease Bazooka is a joke, a fragile toy that looks more like a gutter pipe than a weapon of war. His commander called it useless. His men refuse to carry it, but as the 60-ton behemoth grinds the bones of his comrades into the mud just 30 meters away, the useless pipe is the only thing left between the Red Army and total encirclement. This is the story of the moment the infantry fought back. By the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front had become a gargantuan meat grinder that defied human comprehension. After the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad, the strategic initiative had begun to slip from the Wehrmacht's grasp. However, the German High Command, spurred by Adolf Hitler's obsession with a decisive knockout blow, looked toward a massive bulge in the Soviet lines, the Kursk salient. The plan was dubbed Operation Citadel. The objective was deceptively simple on paper, but terrifying in scale. 2 massive German pincers, one from the north and one from the south, would strike at the base of the salient, meeting in the middle to trap and annihilate nearly a fifth of the Red Army's manpower. To ensure victory, Hitler delayed the offensive for months, waiting for the arrival of his miracle weapons, the PZK-WW Tiger and the brand new PZK-PWW V Panther. The German military machine was banking on technological superiority. The Tiger, with its 100mm of frontal armor and the dreaded 80-mm K-36 gun, was designed to be an apex predator. At the time, it was virtually immune to standard Soviet anti-tank fire at long ranges. The Germans believed that a concentrated wedge of these heavy tanks, the Panzerkeil, could punch through any defensive line, regardless of how many trenches the Soviets dug. On the other side of the wire, the Soviet Stavka was well aware of the impending storm. Under the direction of Generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky, the Red Army transformed the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified patch of ground on Earth. They constructed 8 successive defensive belts, honeycombed with millions of mines, barbed wire, and anti-tank ditches. The Soviet defense relied on anti-tank regions, deadly clusters of 45mm and 76mm guns designed to fire in coordination. But there was a glaring flaw in the Soviet doctrine: the individual infantryman. While the Soviet PTRD-41 and PTRS-41 anti-tank rifles were rugged and plentiful, they were essentially high-powered elephant guns that relied on kinetic energy. Against the thick hide of a tiger or the sloped armor of a panther, these rifles were increasingly becoming little more than metal pecking tools. They could snap a tread or blind a vision port, but they rarely achieved a catastrophic kill. The Soviet infantry needed a way to punch through steel, not just dent it. They needed a weapon that didn't rely on the velocity of a small bullet, but on the chemical energy of an explosion. This gap in their arsenal led to a strange cross-continental experiment. Through the Lend-Lease program, shipments from the United States began to arrive in Soviet ports, containing crates of a weapon the Americans called the M1A1 rocket launcher. To the Soviet generals, who valued the intimidating size of a 76mm divisional gun or the heavy recoil of a long-barreled rifle, the M101 looked absurdly flimsy. It was a hollow tube that used a battery to ignite a small rocket, it lacked the heft of Russian weaponry. Many initial shipments were relegated to warehouses or given to rear echelon units, dismissed as American toys that would likely blow up in the operator's face. The stage was set. The German steel tide was rising, and the Soviet soldiers were about to be forced to use the useless tube, not because they trusted it, but because it was the only thing left that might actually penetrate the heart of a tiger. The arrival of the M1A1 Bazooka in the Soviet Union was met not with cheers, but with a profound, bureaucratic silence. In the early months of 1943, roughly 3,000 units of the 2.36-inch rocket launcher were delivered via the Persian Corridor and the Arctic convoys. For the Soviet military leadership, a nation that equated power with the thunderous roar of the Katyusha rocket or the massive recoil of the ZIS-3 field gun, the American launcher was a technical enigma. The weapon weighed only 13 pounds, roughly the same as a standard infantry rifle. To a Red Army soldier used to the 40-pound, 2-meter-long PTRD anti-tank rifle, the bazooka felt like a prop from a theater production. The technical manuals, translated into Russian with varying degrees of accuracy, described a weapon that utilized an electrical circuit powered by 2 small batteries in the wooden stock. In the freezing damp of Soviet trenches, electrical components were viewed with extreme suspicion. Soldiers feared the batteries would die at the critical moment, or that the exposed wiring would snag on their heavy greatcoats. Furthermore, the ammunition of the M6 rocket looked like a small, finned toy. Soviet ballisticians were skeptical of the hollow charge principle. Traditional Soviet anti-tank doctrine was built on kinetic energy. The faster a solid projectile hits a plate, the more likely it is to punch through. The bazooka, however, used the Monroe effect. It didn't matter how fast the rocket was moving when it hit. What mattered was the focused jet of molten copper created by the shaped charge upon impact. It is a weapon of the desperate, one Soviet ordnance report allegedly stated. It requires the soldier to stand in the open, exposing himself to machine gun fire, only to fire a projectile with the velocity of a thrown stone. The Soviet High Command initially limited the bazooka's distribution. They were worried about the backblast, a massive cone of fire and dust that erupted from the rear of the tube upon firing. In the confined spaces of the Eastern Front's defense in depth, this backblast was a death sentence, revealing the shooter's position to every German sniper and tank commander in the sector. Yet, as June turned to July, the reports from the front grew increasingly grim. The German Panzerabteilung 503 and 505 were moving their Tigers into position. Intelligence suggested these tanks had armor thicknesses that the 45mm Bye-Bye Motherland guns could not hope to pierce from the front. Desperation began to outweigh skepticism. On the eve of the battle, crates of M1A1s were pried open and distributed to select tank destroyer platoons of the 6th Guards Army. These men were given only a few hours of training. They were told how to connect the wires, how to lead a moving target, and most importantly, how to wait until they could see the rivets on the German hulls. The useless pipe was finally in the mud of Kursk. It wasn't welcomed, but as the German artillery began its opening barrage on the morning of July 5th, it was the only weapon the Soviet infantry had that possessed the theoretical power to turn a tiger into a tomb. The bazooka was not a gun in the traditional sense. It was a delivery system for a revolutionary chemical reaction. While the German Tigers relied on the massive thickness of Krupp steel to absorb the impact of solid shells, the M6 rocket used the Monroe effect. When the nose of the rocket struck the Tiger's hull, a fuse ignited a high explosive charge shaped around a conical copper liner. This explosion did not try to blow up the tank from the outside. Instead, it collapsed the copper cone into a hypervelocity jet of molten metal, traveling at roughly 8,000 meters per second. This jet acted like a needle through butter, punching a small, thumb-sized hole through the thickest armor. Once inside, the pressure and molten spray would ignite ammunition and fuel, causing a catastrophic brew-up. This allowed a 13-pound tube to theoretically defeat a 60-ton fortress, a leap in the lethality-to-weight ratio that terrified German crews once they realized their armor was no longer a shield. Operating a bazooka at Kursk was an act of cold-blooded suicidal bravery. Unlike the PTRD rifle, which could be fired from a prone camouflage position, the bazooka required the operator to be partially upright to clear the backblast. The team consisted of a gunner and a loader. The loader's job was the most nerve-wracking. He had to slide the rocket into the rear of the tube, clip the electrical wire to the contact lug, and tap the gunner on the shoulder, all while a Tiger's MG-34 machine gun sprayed the lip of their trench. There was a constant gnawing fear that the primitive batteries would fail in the damp soil, or that the rocket would cook off prematurely. For these men, the weapon wasn't a power-up. It was a burden that required them to let the enemy get within spitting distance, often 50 meters or less, before pulling the trigger. The Soviets integrated the bazooka into hunter-killer groups. At Kursk, these groups didn't sit in the primary trench lines. Instead, they crawled into the no-man's land of tall wheat and sunflower fields. They utilized the bazooka's lack of a muzzle flash to their advantage. While a 45mm anti-tank gun announced its position with a massive cloud of dust and fire, the bazooka's launch was relatively quiet, despite the rear flame. Tactically, this allowed Soviet infantry to remain hidden until the German panzers had bypassed their positions, exposing the thinner side and rear armor of the Tigers. It turned the open steppe into a labyrinth where death could come from a single soldier, hidden in a furrow of dirt. For Soviet commanders like General Nikolai Vatutin, the decision to deploy the bazooka was a gamble with lives. Soviet leadership was notoriously rigid, valuing tried and tested Soviet-made hardware. Introducing a foreign, battery-operated weapon during the most critical defense in the history of the Red Army was seen as a potential liability. Vatutin and his staff had to weigh the risk. If the American pipes failed, entire sectors of the 6th Guards Army could be overrun by German heavy armor without resistance. However, the sheer volume of German Tigers forced their hand. Leadership didn't order the use of the bazooka because they believed in it. They ordered it because they had run out of other options to stop the Panzerkeil. From the perspective of a German Tiger commander, the infantryman was a nuisance, not a threat. In previous campaigns, Soviet infantry would flee or be crushed when the heavy tanks bypassed their trenches. The Germans knew the Soviet anti-tank rifles could not penetrate their frontal plate. This created a dangerous sense of armor hubris. The Tiger crews felt like they were riding in mobile fortresses. When they began seeing the small, slow-moving rockets wobbling toward them, they initially dismissed them as clumsy flares or smoke grenades. The shock of having a 60-ton tank disabled by a single-foot soldier, a man they couldn't even see, shattered German morale more effectively than 1,000 artillery shells. It turned the safe interior of the Tiger into a claustrophobic trap. There is a profound moral and psychological weight to using a weapon like the bazooka. Unlike an artilleryman who fires at coordinates miles away, the bazooka gunner must look his enemy in the eye. To be effective at Kursk, the soldier had to allow the Tiger, a symbol of Nazi mechanical terror, to get close enough to hear the clanking of its tracks and the shouts of its crew. The decision to stay in the hole, to connect the wires while the earth is shaking, represents the ultimate triumph of human will over mechanical terror. It was a one-shot moral contract. If you missed, you were dead. July 7, 1943. 11:30 hours. the Siertzevo-Yakovlevo sector. The German offensive had reached its fever pitch. The SS Panzer Division Das Reich and the 3rd Panzer Division had spent 2 days battering themselves against the Soviet 1st and 2nd lines of defense. Now, they were beginning to chew through the crust of the 6th Guards Army's positions. The air was a shimmering haze of heat, cordite, and pulverized earth. In the sector held by the 67th Guards Rifle Division, the situation was becoming terminal. A fist of approximately 20 Tiger I tanks, supported by Panzer RFORs and Panzer Grenadiers, had found a seam in the Soviet anti-tank ditch network. The Soviet 45mm guns, which had fired until their barrels warped, lay silent, their crews decimated by the Tiger's 88mm high-explosive rounds. The Tigers moved with agonizing, mechanical confidence. They didn't need to maneuver. They simply drove straight over the Soviet trenches, using their tracks to cave in the dugouts, burying the defenders alive. For the Soviet infantrymen watching from the secondary lines, it was a vision of the apocalypse. Their PTRD rifles were snapping uselessly against the Tiger's front plates, like pebbles against a castle wall. It was here, in a forgotten stretch of trench line designated as Point 244.8, that the useless American hardware was finally put to the ultimate test. Sergeant Mikhail Petrov, whose skepticism had been documented in his unit's log just days prior, found himself alone with his loader, Private Volkov, and 2 M1A1 bazookas. The German lead tank, turret number SRO2, was a behemoth of the Schwer Panzerabteilung. It had already crushed a Soviet machine gun nest and was pivoting to enfilade the remaining trench line. Petrov knew the mathematics of the battlefield were against him. The Tiger's hull was 100mm thick at the front, but only 80mm on the sides. To have any hope, he had to let the tank pass his position. He crouched in the bottom of the trench as the ground began to liquefy under the vibration of the Tiger's 700-horsepower engine. Dust rained from the ceiling of his foxhole. Volkov, hands shaking, fumbled with the M6 rocket. The humidity of the morning had made the electrical contacts slick with sweat and grime. He scraped the wires against the metal of the launcher to ensure a connection. The Tiger roared past, less than 10 meters away. The heat from its exhaust was a physical blow to Petrov's face. As the massive rear of the tank crossed his vision, Petrov stood up. He wasn't looking at a tank anymore. He was looking at a series of technical vulnerabilities: the fuel vents, the thin rear plate, the vulnerable engine deck. He hoisted the 1.5-meter tube onto his shoulder. Volkov slammed the rocket home, wired the contact, and slapped Petrov's helmet. "Ready?" Petrov squinted through the rudimentary wire sights. The Tiger was turning, its long 80 pneumatic barrel swinging toward another target. It was now or never. He squeezed the small plastic trigger. The trigger clicked, completing the circuit. For a microsecond, nothing happened then. With a dry metallic whoosh, the M6 rocket ignited. A jet of backblast flames scorched the rear wall of the trench, kicking up a localized dust storm that momentarily blinded Volkov. The rocket, a small, dark shape trailing a thin ribbon of gray smoke, wobbled through the air. It covered the 20 meters in a heartbeat. It didn't strike the thick turret or the reinforced glacis. It struck the Tiger's rear drive sprocket, just inches above the vulnerable fuel reservoirs. Upon impact, the shaped charge warhead functioned perfectly. The copper liner collapsed into a needle-thin jet of plasma that punched through the 80mm of steel as if it were parchment. The jet lanced directly into the Tiger's engine compartment, severing fuel lines and igniting the Maybach engine's high-octane petrol. The explosion was not a loud bang, but a muffled internal thump, followed by a terrifying roar of pressurized fire. A pillar of black smoke erupted from the engine grills. The massive tank, which seconds ago had seemed like an unstoppable force of nature, shuddered to a violent halt. one of its tracks, severed by the blast, unspooled like a dead snake into the mud. Inside the Tiger, the German crew was plunged into a nightmare. Molten copper had sprayed the interior, and the fire suppression system was useless against a chemical fire of that intensity. The commander's hatch flew open, and a frantic crewman scrambled out, his uniform alight, only to be cut down by Soviet submachine gun fire from the neighboring trench. The effect on the rest of the German formation was instantaneous and psychological. To the other tank commanders in the Panzerkeil, it appeared as though the lead Tiger had been struck by an invisible hand. There was no flash from a heavy Soviet gun, no smoke from a hidden bunker. One of their invincible cats had simply burst into flames in the middle of an open field. The German line faltered. The tanks behind S-02 began to reverse or pivot, their commanders frantically searching the high wheat for the source of the strike. They suspected a new, hidden, anti-tank battery. This hesitation was the opening the Soviets needed. Seeing the Tiger burn, the men of the 67th Guards, who had been on the verge of breaking, let out a ragged cheer. Petrov didn't wait. He grabbed the second launcher, already loaded by Volkov. He moved further down the trench, shifting his position to avoid the return fire he knew was coming. 200 meters away, a Panzer IV was turning its turret toward Petrov's smoke trail. He fired again. This time, the rocket struck the Panzer IV's side skirt, the Scherzen. The thin metal plate was designed to pre-detonate Soviet anti-tank rifles, but it was insufficient against the bazooka's shaped charge. The jet punched through the skirt and the hull behind it. The Panzerwaffel's ammunition rack detonated with a force that sheared the turret clean off the hull, sending it tumbling into the dirt. In the span of 90 seconds, the useless American tubes had accounted for 2 German tanks, including a Tiger. The momentum of the local German breakthrough had evaporated. The remaining panzers, fearing a hidden swarm of these high lethality infantry weapons, pulled back to regroup with their infantry support. The line at point 244-8 had held. As the smoke cleared over the Sertsevo-Yakovlevo sector, the physical landscape had changed, but the psychological landscape had been transformed. 2 of the Wehrmacht's most feared armored vehicles sat as smoldering, blackened husks in front of the Soviet trenches. For the German 4th Panzer Army, the shock was not just the loss of hardware, but the realization that their technical superiority had been bypassed by a weapon they didn't even know was in play. German recovery teams and intelligence officers were soon dispatched to examine the wrecks during a lull in the fighting. They were baffled. The holes in the armor were tiny, hardly larger than a finger, yet the internal damage was catastrophic. There was no evidence of a high-velocity kinetic strike which would have left large radial cracks or spalling inside the hull. Instead, the steel looked as if it had been bored through by a thermal drill. The report that filtered back to General Hermann Hoth's headquarters was chilling. The Soviet infantry was no longer just a hurdle to be crushed. They were now tank killers, equipped with a portable, high-lethality weapon that rendered close-quarters armored support a suicide mission. This realization forced an immediate and clunky change in German tactics at Kursk. The Panzerkeil, tank wedge, could no longer operate independently. The tanks were forced to wait for their own Panzer Grenadiers to clear every trench, every hedge, and every furrow of tall rye by hand before the armor could advance. This slowed the German blitzkrieg to a crawl. In a battle where time was the Germans' most precious resource, the bazooka and the fear it inspired bought the Red Army the hours it needed to rush reinforcements to the breakthrough points. On the Soviet side, the useless stigma vanished overnight. Word of Petrov's success spread through the 6th Guards Army like wildfire. The bazooka was no longer a toy. It was the American pocket artillery. Soldiers who had previously refused to carry the tubes were now scavenging the battlefield for discarded launchers and unexploded M6 rockets. The Soviet Stavka, quick to recognize a shift in the wind, began to revise their infantry handbooks mid-battle. They realized that the bazooka allowed for a defense in depth that was active rather than passive. The infantryman was no longer a victim waiting to be overrun. He was a predator waiting for his moment. This shift in confidence contributed to the legendary steadfastness of the Soviet defender at Kursk, an iron-willed refusal to retreat even when tigers were literally grinding over their heads. The success of the bazooka at Kursk reverberated far beyond the burning wheat fields of the Ukraine. It fundamentally altered the relationship between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies regarding Lend-Lease. Prior to July 1943, Soviet officials had been vocal in their demands for heavy tanks and aircraft, often looking down on smaller shipments of infantry equipment. Following the reports from the 6th Guards Army, the tone shifted. The Soviet Procurement Commission began requesting thousands more rocket projectors and, crucially, millions of rounds of heat ammunition. This influx of technology sparked a rapid evolution in Soviet domestic arms development. Soviet engineers, led by teams at the GAU, Main Artillery Directorate, scrutinized the M1A1. While they admired the shaped charge warhead, they remained critical of the American electrical ignition system, which continued to struggle in the grit and extreme temperatures of the East. They wanted the lethality of the American rocket, but with the rugged, hammer and sickle reliability of Russian mechanical engineering. This scrutiny laid the groundwork for the most iconic lineage of anti-tank weapons in history. The lessons learned from the wings in the useless bazooka at Kursk, specifically, the effectiveness of the man-portable shaped charge, directly informed the development of the RPG-1 and the later RPG-2. The Soviet designers moved away from the bazooka's tube-enclosed rocket toward a recoil-less launch system that could fire a much larger warhead. Without the M1A1's proof of concept on the Sirtsevo-Yakovlevo line, the development of the RPG-7, a weapon that still dominates modern battlefields, might have been delayed by years. Strategically, the bazooka's performance at Kursk signaled the end of the invincible tank era. The German High Command was forced to realize that armor was no longer a silver bullet. By the time the Battle of Kursk ended in a decisive Soviet victory, the German Armored Corps had lost more than just tanks. They had lost their psychological edge. The individual soldier, once a mere obstacle, had been elevated to a primary threat. The era of the sledgehammer tank charge was being replaced by a more cautious, bloody, and combined arms reality, where even the mightiest tiger had to fear a single man in a hole. The dust of the Kursk salient has long since settled into the dark, fertile soil of the Russian steppe. Today, the fields near Sirtsevo are quiet. The roar of Maybach engines and the whoosh of rockets replaced by the whistling of the wind through the grain. But the ghost of that 1943 encounter lingers in the very DNA of modern warfare. The story of the useless bazooka is more than a footnote in a military ledger. It is a testament to the unpredictable nature of technology when it meets human desperation. At the start of July 1943, the M1A1 was a foreign curiosity, an unwanted gift from an ocean away. By the end of the month, it had helped shatter the myth of German armored invincibility. It proved that in the cold calculus of war, a 13-pound pipe and a few ounces of copper could, under the right hand, equal the power of a 60-ton fortress. This moment marked a permanent shift in the hierarchy of the battlefield. It was the birth of the tank hunter era, empowering the individual infantryman with the strength of a titan. It democratized lethality, ensuring that no matter how thick the armor or how advanced the electronics, The most dangerous element on any battlefield remains the soldier who refuses to blink. Sergeant Petrov and his loader, Volkov, were not scientists or strategists. They were men in a hole who chose to trust a weapon their superiors had mocked. In doing so, they didn't just stop a breakthrough, they validated a concept that continues to define conflicts across the globe today. History is often written by the victors, but it is forged by those who take the useless tools of their time and through sheer grit, turn them into legends. The Tiger was a masterpiece of engineering, but at Kursk, it met something it couldn't crush. The evolution of courage, delivered through a simple metal tube,